Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Extrospective Podcast with your host, Zach Villeneuve-Snell. Now, today's episode is another solo podcast. It's another rundown of the latest 10 episodes, and we're going to be taking a look at episode 21 through to episode 30. Now, if you've got the privilege of watching the podcast as well as listening to it on YouTube or Spotify or wherever you're streaming this, then you'll see that the quality is dramatically better in terms of the visuals, and that is because I recently picked up a camera. And for those of you who are into your cameras or digital tech nerds, it is a Sony ZV-E10, and I've got the kit lens on there because there's no way I could afford buying a very decent camera and a very expensive lens. So we're starting off with this, and essentially the reason why I've made the purchase for getting a camera is not just for the podcast, although I will be experimenting with it for podcasting, but it's also because I've always been into sort of videography and documenting things and potentially making trailers and doing a bit of marketing, and it opens so many doors when it comes to doing work, freelance work for companies, because I'm not going to say I'm particularly skilled in video editing and production, but it's something that I massively enjoy. You know, I have that creative outlet and element to me that really loves video production. I mean, that's half the reason why I can sit down for hours every week and create podcast content, as well as the actual recording of it and having the conversation. It's because I just love crafting things, and I love seeing something through from beginning to end to the final product. Because, again, if you are listening to this or watching this and you've done a little bit of video editing or production or anything in that kind of remit, you'll understand and appreciate how drastically different the raw video and the idea is at the beginning compared to what it looks like polished and edited and refined at the end. I mean, you guys who have been following me for a while know that I did YouTube vlogs a couple of years ago, and those vlogs dramatically increased my ability with editing. You know, literally doing daily vlogs every day for like 3 months, and then I kind of wound back slightly until finally finishing 8 months later. But I think for most of those days I'd record between 10 minutes and 25 minutes, sometimes even 30 minutes of raw content, and obviously you condense it down into 5 minutes. You add little transitions and memes and different things, and you just refine the product and make it visually nice. And there's so many things I can do with a camera, even if it's just photography on a holiday. You know, there's so many different things that I can do with it, and I've wanted to have a proper camera for a long time and save up money. So I won't waffle on, but essentially I'm really excited that I'm able to use this. And in podcasts in the future, what I'll be doing is I'm currently using a software called Zencastr, which is a bit of an upgrade from using Google Meets, which is what I was doing from like episode 1 to like 25. But more recent episodes, you might have noticed the quality is better, the real production is better, and that's because I'm using a software which essentially uploads the raw quality up to the cloud, and I can download from the guest side rather than it being like through the internet connection. It's actually the local recording, so obviously it's however good their webcam or setup is on their end, rather than relying on the internet connection. And hopefully this camera can do that. It's limited to 720p as a webcam, but a very high quality camera at 720p is better than a webcam at 1080p or whatever it might be. So we'll have to wait and see. But anyway, I'll probably do a solo podcast at some point with a bit of a Q&A, answering a few questions, because I feel like you guys, as much as, you know, there are friends that listen to this and potentially some other people that are gradually beginning to listen to this and build an audience, and I'm seeing the numbers go up week on week very, very gradually, and it's very exciting to me. But I feel like I've never actually introduced myself on a podcast, because I just obviously release the episodes week in, week out, and then I occasionally do these sort of summary episodes, but of course, I'm still talking about the guests. I'm not actually, you know, giving any life updates or my own thoughts on different questions and things that people might have. And I am quite keen to share more myself moving forward online. And I used to, but yeah, I want to keep it obviously guest primarily focused and learning, like me learning. Hopefully, then learning in public, bringing you guys along with me. But at the same time, you know, I do also, from all these podcasts and from all my experiences with endurance training and triathlon and gym, like I do feel like I do have some level of value to offer as well. So hopefully I can chip in with a few things. But that's a bit of a intro to today. Let's just get cracking into the 21 to 30 and a bit of a summary. And again, this is spontaneous. I haven't made any notes. I'm literally just thinking back to what I remember having the conversation with that individual, and I'm hoping to cut this as little as possible, if not at all, and just be completely raw and honest and just straight to the point. So it's a little bit different because episode 21 was a follow-on from episode 20. If you remember, I recorded with an individual called Tom Ramsey, who is a cycling performance coach, very knowledgeable about all things strength training, nutrition, periodization. Obviously, cycling is his primary specialization. But essentially, we did 2 episodes, and episode 21 was answering all of your cycling/endurance sport-related questions. And so, to be honest, I will do a bit of a recap. Obviously, it's not just from him individually, because that was episode 20. But I think, firstly, the thing I took away was he's very knowledgeable about what he does, and he's very you can trust him as a coach. But I think the one thing that really stood out is it confirmed why I was taking creatine, because a question I had, and I hadn't done that much research into creatine, was whether it's good for endurance cyclists or whether it's just for gym rats, or is it safe. And the conclusion I gathered from him and subsequently online as I've done my research is that creatine is fantastic. It's probably the best, cheapest supplement you can get for the biggest increase. And it is, of course, a marginal gain, but it's a gain and it's not that expensive. You're talking, I don't know, 15 or 20 quid for a month or two's worth of daily doses. And that's very minimally expensive when you consider it does have tangible effects on squeezing out the last few reps or repeatable efforts, or even cognitively. There's some studies of creatine being able to, make you more switched on and more focused and concentrated. But yeah, anyway, obviously we talked about a lot of things. I'd recommend going back to that podcast and listening to it. But yeah, the number one thing that really springs to mind is just we had a bit of a discussion on creatine and the fact that it is pretty good, even if you're a cyclist, and go and check out the podcast to understand why. Just a quick note before I continue is I decided just to stick my camera on its tripod right in front of me here without putting any sort of light on, and I'm hoping that it is a quite sunny day. The sun's kind of going through the clouds, coming back out the clouds, so the lighting's changing a little bit. I'm looking at the little screen, but it's all good because it's a great camera, so it can adjust all those things. But just thought I'd point that out. Episode 22 is The Dream is Still Alive, signing the contract and racing with pros in Africa with semi-professional cyclist Tom Portsmouth. Now, this was a bit of a follow-up episode from episode 1 of the podcast, which if you haven't checked out, I recommend going and listening back to the initial episode, the foray into podcasting with Tom. Tom helped sort of inspire this, to be honest, because he'd set up his own podcast and we were living together last year at uni. And so we did episode 1 together. He's on this journey of trying to become a professional cyclist, and it got to back in the last year, and he signed a contract with it's a professional team, but he's on the development squad with an aim to try and get onto the professional squad in the next couple of years, which I think he has a very good shot at, considering he's already been invited to several pro events, and this was a demonstration of it. This was episode 22, and he was already out guesting on the pro team out in Africa. And to be honest, the lesson I took away from that is just Tom's perseverance, especially in the face of potentially a lot of doubters, but potentially a lot of people that are questioning his ability to be able to, mix it with the top guys. I know he's often struggled with weight as a cyclist because, the stereotypical cyclist is, Chris Froome, like a really praying mantis, really skinny guy that's trying to get uphill as be as light as possible for going uphill. But Tom defying those odds, and to be fair, losing weight and getting lean, but more importantly, gaining power and learning the tactics of being in the bunch. And it's just I was just really proud of him. Like obviously meeting him a couple of years ago, and even just in the short window I've seen him, a real window into what it takes to really aspire to be put towards professional, and then I obviously call him between races and stuff, and we have a chat, and it's just really inspiring seeing someone who doesn't leave any stone unturned and is very clinical with their execution. And I think we can all take something away from that when it comes to how we apply ourselves, rather than half-assing everything, and rather than saying, I'll never make it, I haven't got the right genetics, or I started too late, or, I don't fit in quite as much as I see the people around me. Just go for it and apply yourself 100%, because it's only after doing that you'll figure out, where you end up. But you don't want to leave untapped potential on the table, because there's a quote, and it's It's like the thing that you don't want to do is meet the person in 10 years' time who was the same as you, but basically went and tried to achieve their potential, compared to you that didn't. You don't want to meet your future self who did that. It'd be just disappointing, because you'd be like, oh, this was all that was possible if only I believed in myself. So stick to something 100% and see how far it gets you. Episode 23 was Lessons from 6 years of Cold Water Exposure with lifestyle engineer Matt Chenard. Now, I reached out to Matt kind of on a whim. I wasn't expecting him to reply, really, because his Instagram page blew up from doing ice baths. I don't know if you can remember, but back in December, they were just appearing on everyone's Explore feed. And for some reason, Instagram seemingly was really pushing it in the self-development world. And Matt Chenard popped up. He does daily ice baths, and I reached out to him, asking all about it. Because not only was he just doing ice baths, but he was also talking and providing a lot of commentary on general self-development and life and habits and lifestyle. And we followed a lot of similar accounts, and it was a fantastic conversation. The podcast really, really was valuable. And I have to say, I wasn't expecting going into it. I thought we were going to have a good discussion, but it was mainly on ice baths. But he had a lot to say on a lot of cultural and topical issues. But I think the main thing that I took away from Matt is the idea of compound habits. He refers to them as daily deposits, and I really like that, because you're just it's the same as like putting money gradually in the bank and then obviously letting interest accumulate on that money. And it's almost the same way of daily deposits with other areas of life. Like he does his like daily devotionals, wakes up and reads the Bible and prays, and he wakes up and he does his ice baths, and he goes to the gym, and he consistently invests in his wife and spending quality time with her, and he lists this all as like relational and spiritual and emotional and physical deposits. And I really like the way he frames that, and it's quite unique, because I haven't heard it anywhere else. He's the one that's framing this as earning your dopamine and getting in your daily deposits. And that just reminded me of the importance of compound interest and daily habits, and just nailing the fundamentals. And we can have spontaneity, and there's this idea that discipline equals freedom, and I'm a complete believer of that, because if you set up the structure of your day such that the first hour of your day is the same every day, the last hour of your day is the same every day, and you do one thing in the middle of the day that is the same every day, and you're just checklisting off every single day, bang, bang, bang. Yes, obviously with variation sometimes with rest days and stuff, but you just nail those basics. It just sets you up so that the rest of your time you're ready to engage with the world optimally, and you're not worrying about having not done something. Like, you've achieved and you've won the day and you've done all these things. And I think doing those daily deposits, just from now to 5 years' time, you'll be in a completely different place in a really fantastic way. So just quick mouse wiggle. Currently at work. Episode 24 was The Case for Motherhood and the Psychology of Hospitality with organisational psychologist Tracy Zhu. Now, Tracy was the last of the TEDx speakers that I had the privilege of talking to on the podcast. As I've mentioned before, I hosted TEDx Surrey University back in 2022. And of course, a TEDx event is a fantastic pool of experts and really interesting people. And so when I started the podcast, it was only natural that I reached out to a few of them that I kind of developed some rapport with and were interested in their topic. And Tracy was the last one that I sort of reached out to. And her talk was on the bright side of motherhood, and on the podcast we talked a lot about her research on that, and also other topics that she researches, and her own personal journey. She grew up in China, studied in China, moved across to America, and then finally kind of settled down in the UK. And I think what I took away from that is that there is such a fantastic element to motherhood which can be useful in the workplace. And it wasn't really something I was going into the podcast expecting to discover or learn or agree with. My views are, anyone can make the choices that they want, but the family is the most important thing. And there's a C.S. Lewis quote which says that the family, it says that the being a mother is the ultimate career, and all other careers serve to provide for that career, because children and a family sits above everything else, if that makes sense. So going to work and pursuing monetary and the status and climbing the hierarchy is only there to facilitate a family, in my view. Otherwise it's just self-gratifying and self-serving, and and unfulfilling at the end of the day, and just become materialistic. And so because of that, obviously, if the motherhood is the most important role to facilitate, women need to become mothers. But the way that Tracy described it is that as she's gone back into work, because obviously she's had a little daughter, and she's working full time as an organizational psychologist and a marketing expert, events expert, she's learned a lot of lessons from her daughter that she's then applied to the workplace, and how starting a family has actually given her a much greater appreciation in the workplace, and her priorities have shifted. And it was just really interesting to hear her perspective, because each perspective is unique. Some people will go back to full-time work and be really career-driven. Some people will stay to part-time. Some people will just, take paternity leave and become essentially unemployed, be a full-time mother, depending on different people's contexts and situations. But I think with Tracy, it was interesting to learn how her daughter taught her lots of things, especially being a foreign parent, I suppose, growing up with a daughter that's in a foreign country. She was learning a lot of like new English terms and phrases, and like almost a way of thinking as well from the school. And I think that's quite interesting. Even though I think work should be serving family, it seems as if in this instance Tracy was able to see how family was serving work. And I guess they are interlinked and very good for personal development, having a family and children. The greatest responsibility I think anyone can really take on. So if there's anything you can learn from Jordan Peterson, is that responsibility is where meaning is found, and clearly it's very useful for her. Episode 25 was Masculinity Crisis in the West. What does it mean to be a man, with men's educator Rick Cooper. What an episode this was. Rick Cooper. I reached out to him on LinkedIn because I just randomly stumbled across him from a mutual follower, and I saw someone had liked his post about him talking about what it means to be a man with a group of 14-year-old boys, I think, in a school. And I thought, oh, crumbs, like, what's going on here? Like, what is this initiative? So I connected with him, I started following his posts, and then I reached out to him because I thought the posts that I was seeing were so fascinating. I didn't know this was even going on in UK schools, where they were, bringing in an external speaker to talk to young men about what it means to be a man, particularly in the wake of sensationalist and viral clips from Andrew Tate, sort of in the, the last few months really before he was put in prison. And I won't put any commentary on that whole situation, but really it is very important to go into school to clarify to young boys and build a more holistic and rounded view of what it means to be a man, rather than potentially very dogmatic and isolated clips that people were hearing from Andrew Tate. And I think what we do need to remember is that whilst, maybe there are listeners to this who do like Andrew Tate, or maybe there are listeners who don't like Andrew Tate, I think it's important to appreciate that there is nuance, and that you can take 20% or 40% or 60% or 80% of what someone is saying, depending on how much your views align with that person. But you can disagree with 80%, 60%, 40%, 20% of what they're saying. And there's nuance, and you can see light and shade, and you can appreciate someone is saying something of value without completely worshipping and adoring them as an individual as a whole. But I think the problem is with young men is they are more likely to do that. They are more likely to be blindsided to the negatives and the things they maybe shouldn't be agreeing with. And I think what Rick was going into schools and doing is just dispelling some myths on what it means to be a man, and providing a greater picture. And what I took away the most, the biggest one single lesson from that podcast, is just the more rounded view of masculinity, which I hadn't really come across before. There's these archetypes that he spoke about, and I honestly hold my hands up here. As much as I loved it at the time, and I've really integrated it into my worldview, I can't remember the specific personality trait breakdowns of each archetype. I know, shoot me. But I think there was, it's just the idea that masculinity is about, providing and being stoic sometimes, but it's also about being loving and caring and compassionate and conclusive and forgiving and loving. And all these things which Rick said, the boy's eyes just lit up like, well, why has no one told me this before? And I think having that far more rounded view of masculinity is so important, and I won't bang on about it, but one of the biggest things that I have really thought and mulled over the last 6 months to a year is the need for a middle way and nuance between right and left wing when it comes to temperament, when it comes to how you deliver and communicate. And I think this was a perfect balance, because I think the left does a great job of being compassionate and loving and forgiving and accepting and non-judgmental. But I think the right is often right, but the way they communicate methods is very unloving and provocative and hurtful and divisive, and that's not helping anyone either, and it's just driving the political wedge. And I don't think a lot of these issues necessarily need to be political. I think we need to take the temperament spectrum from both and appreciate that sometimes the stuff that the right is saying is right, but they need to communicate it in the way that the left does, and sometimes the stuff that the left is saying is correct, and they need to communicate it in the way that the right does, and there needs to be that sort of nuance and balance and middle way between the two. And I think Rick provided a fantastic blueprint for what it means to be a man in this episode, and it's a very cultural and topical hot topic, talking about masculinity. But I think Rick did a fantastic job of dispelling the myths and providing a clear framework for what it means. Even though obviously I don't agree with everything that he was saying, I do agree with the vast majority of it. And as I mentioned with Andrew Tate, you have to you have to be a bit more pragmatic with your viewpoints and be a bit more, sensible and grown up. And I probably agree with 90% of what you're saying. So really highly endorse listening to that, to be honest, if it's something that you've struggled with or you're just looking to understand. Speaking of things that people struggle with, episode 26 is porn addiction to over 1 million followers with Brazilian content creator Augusto Caten. Now, I wasn't expecting what direction this conversation was going to go in, but I met Augusto at a Jordan Peterson event in September. Just randomly, I was queuing next to him in the sort of meet and greet afterwards, and I was having a conversation with him, and he was telling me that he has a big following, and I checked on Instagram, and he's like a couple of 100,000 followers. I was like, crumbs, okay, like he wasn't joking about this, and this was right at the beginning of when I was starting the podcast. I think I released episode 1 like the week after this, and here I was saying that I was also going to start creating content, not on the same level. But it was fantastic to connect. And then all these months later, I thought, he'd probably be actually a great guest on the podcast if he's up for it. So I shoot my shot, and he got back to me and he said, yeah, you know what, I'd love to come onto a podcast. He'd never done one before. And we had a great conversation. We went into a lot of detail on a lot of really important topics. He was very, very, very raw and honest with me when it came to his own personal journey and, how he now uses that to help young men. And if I was going to take away one lesson from that podcast, it's probably the importance of vulnerability. I think because I wasn't expecting him to be so open and vulnerable and raw and honest with his own personal struggle with porn and sort of when he was with his girlfriend. And I won't go into the graphic details of everything he said on the podcast. You can go back and listen to that. But I think the way he's able to be so vulnerable is the part of the reason why he's reached so many people and so many people follow him, because I think too many of us try and put up a front like we're big, strong, tough people. We don't let things in life affect us. And again, there's utility to that in context and in certain environments. But especially online, we don't want to provide a false framework of perfection for people to think, oh, I could never be like that. And connection comes when there is vulnerability. And I think Augusto kind of demonstrated that to me, where he's very honest about things that are really taboo to talk about and kind of gross to think about. But he was talking about it so openly and candidly, and that's why thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands of men, young men and boys, have connected with his message. And I think that was what struck me, to be honest. Overall, not talking about any specific issue, but just the way he's very open and authentic with what he shares. Kind of rung true to me is very nice to see, especially compared to previous generations where things have been always like taboo and it always matters about what other people think about you, and it's always about saving face and not showing weakness. And it's really nice to see how in that vulnerable space there's room then for connection and improvement and growth. Highly recommend following him, by the way, even though everything he says is in Portuguese. You still get the gist of it sometimes. Episode 27 is Lord Sugar's BBC The Apprentice, The Truth, with conservationist and entrepreneur Joe Phillips. Now, I was kind of inspired by a friend of the podcast, fellow podcaster and previous guest, David McIntosh, because he had on Aaron Willis last year from The Apprentice. And I remember thinking to myself, wow, now I've got the opportunity to have a podcast myself. Imagine if I could connect with one of the apprentice candidates who I really love to watch and think is a genuinely good person with a genuinely good message aside from just being an apprentice candidate. And you know what, I'm fully transparent. I think, the podcast is all about providing value for me, for the listener, and for the guest. And I always think about those three things when getting on a guest. And in this case, I wanted to provide a lot of value for him because it needed to be worth his time. I wanted it to be valuable for people who followed The Apprentice so that, if they follow him on social media and they see a clip and then they tune into the podcast, they actually take something away from it meaningful other than just me asking questions about what The Apprentice was like, even though a lot of people want to hear about that. But Joe was genuinely a really fascinating person to talk to, and I'm really privileged to be able to have the opportunity to speak to him. I mean, even when I reached out to him, I said it with complete honesty and conviction. He was the only person I reached out to from The Apprentice, and it was because I saw he got fired really for being too honest and being too vulnerable and open in the boardroom, and that's a trait that I really admire in someone. And even though, again, there's context, as I mentioned, for being like this, and potentially he was in applying that in the wrong context, I think it's an admirable trait, and his work on growing up in the bush, as he describes it, and being out with nature, and even now going out and doing animal conservation work alongside his full-time job and his business, it's just really admirable, and I think that was a message that I wanted to explore. So if there's one takeaway from that, it's not anything to do with The Apprentice really, although that was obviously a great story and a big attraction to why people would listen to it. His love for nature, his connection and grounding in the outdoors and with animals reminded me, and I hope it reminded the listeners, of where we come from and the importance of remaining grounded in that and not becoming too disconnected with modern technology and with being indoors and with shelter and comfort and safety, and just the importance of getting out there and experiencing life for what it has to offer, even if sometimes it's more risky or more uncertain, because there is something about overcoming adversity and challenge in nature and outdoors and just being in the elements. And I think his message on the podcast was that more people need to really reconnect with that, and it's something that I wholeheartedly agree with. Having done a lot of cycling and hiking and walking and running and stuff, I love being out in nature, and it's a reminder to myself as well, as much as anything, that I need to go and do that more. And I don't take it too much for granted. I think, especially health and being able to do that, having a body that's able to do that is something I take for granted. So I'm sure it might be the case for people listening too. Episode 28 was with Colin Campbell. This was Pursuing Peak Performance with Relentless Discipline with office athlete Colin Campbell, episode 28, as I said. Colin Campbell has an incredible podcast. He's shared content online for a number of years. I didn't follow him a number of years ago, but he was doing a lot of fitness content and growing a personal brand, and has grown to a significant following on Instagram, LinkedIn, and things like that. And he started a podcast 3 years ago, and I recently connected him through David, and I now listen to his podcast weekly on a Sunday, and it's really high quality production and some really high quality guests. He's on episode 185 as of recording this, and he's someone who inspires me and who I obviously look up to in the world of podcasting and self-development. And so it was great to have an opportunity to chat with him long form in a podcast and share that with the world. And again, it's hard to distill or condense an entire conversation, an entire person down into one lesson. But there was a consistent theme in the podcast which cropped up in his own story as well as our own discussion, which is just flipping adversity on its head and using it for a benefit. He's had several moments in his life where, you could say the rug has been pulled from under his feet, and unanticipated disaster or shocks have occurred, but each time he's bounced back relatively quickly and used it as an opportunity to bounce back and go one step further. And I think that comes down to the importance of almost the same as what I was mentioning with Matt Chenard when it comes to doing consistent daily deposits and compound interest and doing the daily stuff, regardless of whether you feel like it every single day. Because then when the external shocks do occur, you're fortified and prepared for them, and you can get back on track faster because you already know tomorrow, regardless of what's happening externally, you're going to get to the gym, you're going to do your daily devotionals or meditation or daily walks or steps, and you're going to do whatever it takes eating wise or lifestyle wise for you. You know, again, it's very personalized, it's very individual, but whatever those things are, you just do them regardless of the external factors, and it kind of steadies the ship and keeps you on track. And I think that's just a huge reason why you would go to the gym or do daily Bible reading or meditations or yoga or, you know, anything like this, you know, eat well, is because you're then prepared for whatever comes in the future. If you're putting yourself in voluntary discomfort every single day, when involuntary discomfort comes your way, you're far more mentally and physically prepared to respond to that. You've already done the reps, you've already gone through the motions of doing something that you don't want to do and overcoming it and callousing your mind, as David Goggins says. And now this thing is being imposed on you. It's like, great, I've already done this every single day for the last 6 years. What more can you throw at me? I think that's a powerful position to be in. Not an easy one, but a powerful one. And I think that's probably the lesson that I took away from Colin. As well as his, you know, relentless work ethic when it comes to the podcast. You know, he's literally done it for 3.5 years, or 3 years, just over 3 years. And I don't think he's missed a single week, and sometimes he does double episode releases. And it's just super inspiring seeing that relentless discipline, and again, the habits and the daily deposits, as Matt Chenard would say. Episode 29 is From Lawn Mowing in Lithuania to Managing the UK's Largest Festivals with Events Expert Eimantas Budrys. This kind of closed a chapter on the podcast for TEDx stuff because, as I mentioned, Tracy with the last of the speakers. There are a number of speakers in sort of episode 10 through to episode 20, so if you want to go and listen back to that summary or any of the episodes, you can go and do so. But TEDx wouldn't have been a thing for me if Eimantas hadn't have sort of picked me out in Freshers' Fair in, back in February 2022. I won't go into it, I'll talk about it in the podcast, but essentially we connected and we did TEDx together. He ran the event. I obviously was very privileged to host it and do a lot of the marketing for it. And in that episode, we talk everything events management, you know, the inside scoop of what it's like to be on the ground in the UK's largest festivals and how he's ended up there from, as the title says, lawn mowing in Lithuania and going around as a scrawny 13, 14-year-old kid, essentially taking a old school idea of cutting people's grass, but turning it into a fully profitable business by hiring his friends and working full time all summer. You know, really entrepreneurial and taking the initiative. And it's a great story. It has lots of insights as a result, and he shares his journey now on his personal brand on LinkedIn primarily. And I think the one takeaway from him is probably the importance of just going for things and figuring out afterwards, because there's a consistent theme within his journey which he picks up on multiple times, which is how there was even one moment where a culinary chef came to do like a talk at his school, and there was only time for one question, and he just stood up out of his chair and was just like, "You've talked a lot about volunteering and how volunteering helped you. Can I volunteer at your chef place, restaurant?" And the guy was like, "I don't take volunteers, but you can come and work for me for a bit." And it was just crazy to me hearing that level of initiative and not caring about what other people think in that moment, just to stand up even though that's kind of awkward, or very awkward, to seize the opportunity and be that standout person. And doing that consistently puts you in an upper echelon to the point where he is now, where he's probably one of the top leading students at Surrey in what he does. He's really making the most of the networks that are available through his lecturers and colleagues. And I think it's something which not a lot of people realise, is that, you know, if you seize those opportunities, if you really go the extra mile, there is so much more available to you than you could ever have imagined. And I think he's going to be destined for a very successful career in events management. I think he wants to go into consulting. So, yeah, I mean, if you want to follow his journey, just check him out on LinkedIn. Really, really insightful posts and very relatable as well for a young person to follow along with the journey. Episode 30 and the final episode for this solo podcast recap of the last 10 episodes, well, episode 21 to 30, is episode 30, which is battling cancer whilst building a 7-figure business with influencer marketing entrepreneur Suhit Amin. And I'm very sorry to Suhit that I kept saying Suhit Amin or Amin, but it's Amin. I've checked. Pronunciation is not my strong suit. But Suhit is an enigma, really, if that's the right word to use. He's highly intelligent, highly conscientious, and has been that way for a long time. Very entrepreneurial from a young age, and in that space of sort of digital marketing through connecting brands with influencers, especially in the YouTube space, and then transitioning, still doing that, but now doing it in just social media in general. You know, TikTok influencers and whatnot. And his story was particularly powerful because of the fact that he got cancer when he was 16 or 17. I think it was 16. It was type 2A Hodgkin's lymphoma, if I can remember correctly. But essentially, you know, he felt something in his neck. And we don't talk about his cancer story in much detail on the podcast because he's trying to move away from, you know, the boy that survived cancer. But we do talk about it, and more we talk about, you know, the mental side of it and how he overcame it and used it to fuel his journey of entrepreneurialism. And, you know, he was already starting businesses and making a lot of money at a young age in this whole space, but it was the cancer that really kind of put a fire under his arse as to, like, you know, when you're facing mortality, you just get stuff done, because you don't know if you're going to wake up the next morning, or, and I know it's pretty scary to think about, but if you knew that, how differently would you act? Would you be cruising in your life? Would you be taking life easily? Would you just be going through the motions? Or would you be really driven and motivated to go and do that thing that you're too scared of doing, or really, you know, work that extra hour and just put the effort in? I think Suhit's story is a clear demonstration of how important that is. And it's very hard to, I was talking about this with him, and we're, you know, saying, if you didn't have that, would you be in that position that you are now? And it's hard to say how you would artificially sort of engineer that in your life. How you would, by not having cancer, but almost tricking your brain into being in that sort of scenario, how would you try and really act as if every day is your last, and how that would affect your outcomes and your performance in different areas of life. And it's a difficult one, because I often like to consider myself as a hard worker, but there's definitely complacency and procrastination that I perhaps wouldn't be there if I knew I was going to die tonight or tomorrow night, or, you know, in 3 months' time or a year's time. And I think an abundance of comfort gives us the illusion that we have forever. And whilst we do have a lot of time, I think people underestimate, you know, you do have a lot of time, but just get started now. You know, you have time if you start now, regardless of how much time you actually have. It's just a mindset thing. And I think, yeah, I mean, the one lesson I'll take from his journey is just seizing what's in front of you and just giving it your all, because you never know if you're going to pass away in 3 months or 6 months or a year or 5 years or 10 years. Like, you just don't know when that day is going to happen. So why would you not be giving your all to pursuing what you love doing and working hard towards it every single day? And it's something I need to reflect on, even with this podcast. You know, I'd like to say I put a lot of effort into it, but there's a lot of time when I know I could be putting more effort into it, doing better guest research, creating better thumbnails, doing better editing. I guess I bought, to go full circle back to the beginning of this episode, but bought the camera is a bit of an investment. Again, not just for the podcast. Podcast wasn't an afterthought, but it definitely wasn't the primary consideration as to why I got it. But again, just leveling up and really just going full in on something. And it speaks to what I was saying earlier about that nightmare of reaching the version of yourself that reached their potential when you were slacking, and seeing what you could have done if only you'd put your hard work to the test and started grinding. So that's probably wrapping up this solo episode of Recap. That's episode 21 to 30. I have no idea what the file size is going to be on this 4K recording on my new camera, Sony ZF E10. But I'm sure we'll soon find out if this episode actually makes it up tonight, or whether the file size is just enormous and it will take 7 million hours to upload. But I hope that was insightful. I hope that you guys took something away from my synopsis of each episode, and I hope that some of those episodes that I've talked about stand out to you, and maybe you didn't check them out initially, but you're gonna go now back and check them out, because genuinely, for different reasons, every single podcast that I release, I wouldn't record with the individual and I wouldn't release it if I didn't think it provided real, true value for someone who's going to tune in. And I'm really working on prioritising that as well, and really ensuring that the quality and the questions that I ask and the guests that I have on really align and gradually are niching down towards what I think you guys would want to hear. And if you guys do have any guest suggestions or suggestions in general for the podcast, please do get in touch. I'd love to hear. I've heard it a few times already, and it kind of blows me away. But I've heard a few messages of people in support. They go out of their way to send me a message saying, I really love what you're doing, or I've really enjoyed this particular episode. There were particular takeaways that have really helped, and that just brings so much joy to my heart. And I think it gives me a great feedback loop of why I need to keep doing this and keep pushing and keep improving, because I get so much from it. I hope you guys are getting a lot from it, as I mentioned, and hopefully I'm providing as much value as possible for the guest. But I know you guys are busy. I won't waffle on. It seems to be that these 21 to 30 or 11 to 20 or 1 to 10, these summary episodes tend to be about 45 minutes long. And here we are approaching the 45-minute mark. Camera's on 56% and it was on 100 at the beginning. So again, good to test the sort of battery capacity and whether I'd need a portable charger if I wanted to do this in real life with this camera. My internet's just gone down, but good thing that obviously this doesn't require internet. But anyway, guys, if you did enjoy this podcast episode, then please do leave a 5-star rating wherever you're listening, on Spotify or Apple Music, Apple Podcasts, or Google or Amazon or whatever you might be listening to, or even on YouTube. If you're watching us on YouTube, remember to hit that like button and subscribe. I think we're nearly at 500 subscribers, which is a pretty big milestone. And yeah, really appreciate the continued support. Maybe I'll do a solo Q&A episode at some point. But until then, plenty of great episodes coming up and lined up. Shoot me a message for any guest suggestions you may have. And until next week, my name has been Zach Villeneuve-Snell, and I'll catch you next time.